Hello, welcome to Making with Marc. I'm Marc, and today we're making some siege towers out of coffee stirrers and balsa wood. These would be perfect for games like Warhammer Age of Sigmar, Lord of the Rings, the Old World, or any fantasy game really. You could even use them as terrain during D&D. Let's get stuck in. First of all, we're going to need to know how big our walls are. Siege towers were mostly built on site during a siege, and made specifically for the fortification they were going to be used against. In this case, the tallest part of our wall is 14 centimeters high, which is the height our siege towers will need to be in order to successfully get troops over the Merlins. We're going to sketch out a rough plan for our towers on some graph paper. We don't need to follow it exactly for every detail, but it'll be useful as a general guide while we're working, and can help us visualise what our final towers will look like. By measuring the height of the wall, we know what height our ramp will need to be at. I also wanted any figures standing on the top level to be protected by walls around them, and a quick check with this arc gives us a final height of 20 centimeters. I was initially going to give the towers a depth of only 4 centimeters at the top, but I thought this looked too narrow on the final sketch, so I lengthened it to 5 centimeters. I then did another sketch from the front to check the width. I wanted it to be wide enough for two figures on 40mm bases to stand next to each other, so we needed a width of 8 centimeters, and the other measurements could be lifted from the other sketch. To begin the actual construction phase of the build, I took a variety of square balsa wood profiles and began cutting them to the lengths needed for the front profile of the siege towers. Thicker beams were used where possible, as while balsa wood is very easy to work with, it isn't the strongest material out there. To cut the thinner balsa wood pieces, a regular hobby knife is fine. If you want to avoid crushing or compressing the thicker pieces though, I recommend using a hobby saw. The final dimensions were checked by lining up the wood on our sketch. For this particular build, it doesn't matter if we're a little off here and there, as long as we're happy with the overall look. I then glued the pieces together while they were in place, only to quickly regret it once I realised how well wood glue sticks to paper. I'm making 3 siege towers in total. This is so I can have several on the table at once, and better capture the feeling of a major assault happening. From a gameplay perspective, it also means that we can come up with some stats or rules for them being destroyed by projectiles from the defending garrison, and still have more that the attackers can use to scale the walls. Here are the beginnings of our 3 frames. Next we're working on the frames for the sides of the siege towers. Again, balsa wood profiles were cut to length following the sketch, until we had enough pieces for both sides of each tower. For the beams on the sides, I wanted them to have some thickness on one axis for strength, but I didn't want them too thick or they'd start to take up space that could be used to shelter miniatures. I used my hobby knife to score the balsa wood down its length and split the profiles in half. To attach these to the front frames, I propped up the frames on some boxes at right angles. I first checked that all of the pieces lined up with the sketch, then glued them into place. Once they'd dried, I simply flipped the piece over and glued the pieces to the next side into place. Again, we want to check that all of the pieces line up, at least with the lines on the graph paper or cutting mat. Then we can glue them in place. We now have the frames for our 3 siege towers. To make the planks for this project, we're going to be using coffee stirrers. They're cheap and easily available from a range of different trade stores. I think this bag of 1,000 only cost a couple of euros. And they're a really good size to fit in with the scale of 148, 32mm sort of scale miniatures, so perfect for something like this. 8 centimeters is the longest any of our planks will need to be. We could work out all of the different lengths needed for the slopes and cut planks specifically for them, but for the sake of being able to do things in batches, we're just going to cut all of our planks to the same length now, and then cut them down later when they're in place. We'll start by cutting off the rounded ends of the coffee stirrers, then cut the rest of the stirrers to the lengths we need. You can cut coffee stirrers with just about anything, and ordinarily I call this device a luxury that most people don't need. For this project though, with the sheer number of coffee stirrers we're going to cut, I'd very much recommend getting something like this chopping tool. I'm building these towers to use in my Orc war clans. The lore I've made for my army is that they're being led by an ancient archdemon type creature that's awoken to find all of its old territories covered in sprawling settlements. Through magic, guile and force, it's co-opted the cruel boys that have been driven into the nearby mountains, and has organised them into an army capable of laying siege to what it sees as interlopers on its land. To fit with the army, I'm going to weather the planks quite heavily, cutting notches and angles to make them look like planks that were sawn very roughly. If you want to clean the look to your siege towers, or perhaps just want to save some time, you can leave the planks unaltered at this stage. We're going to start placing the planks on the front of the siege towers first. A lot of these are going to be partly covered by banners and cloths, so I haven't fully weathered all of these ones, but I'm still deliberately placing them in a slightly higgledy-piggledy manner to fit with my army's aesthetic. For your siege towers, you might prefer to place them in a more organised fashion, depending on what look you're going for. Once the fronts had been finished, I did the same to the sides. To get the planks to match the slope of the frame, I placed each plank into its position, then used some clippers to snap off the excess length. I wanted to add some extra reinforcement to the towers and build a small frame to lay the top level platform onto later. Once these have been added, I continued to cover the sides of the towers in planks, again aiming for that rough around the edges look. When building your own siege tower, it's worth checking occasionally that your plank rows are still level with the bottom of the frame, or you can get to the end and find that one side of the planks is lower than the other. The last main sections to plank were the standing platforms at the top, where troops can wait to charge across as soon as the ramp is lowered. Now the basic shapes of the towers have been done, we need to make the ramps. For these, we'll use some wooden kebab skewers to act as the hinge pin, and we'll make the gudgeons later using styrene. As you can probably guess, the rest will be made out of more coffee stirrers. Now we've made the ramps, we're going to use pieces of styrene tubing to make the gudgeons that attach them to the tower. This will allow us to make the ramps functional, so we can raise and lower them during games. The tubing did need a bit of cleaning up after being sawn, but this is easily done with a sharp knife. Arguably the chopper would have produced a cleaner cut, but it would have compressed the tubing more and potentially warped the shape so that they wouldn't allow the ramps to move freely. Once they've been cleaned up, we could slide them into the pins, then glue them onto our siege towers. Some of the ramps moved a little too freely side to side and risked coming out of their hinges. To fix this, I glued a few offcuts onto the pins just next to the gudgeons to prevent them from sliding around too much. Once the glue had dried, I did a few tests and I wasn't entirely satisfied with the angles that the ramps were moving at. The support planks were hitting the front of the tower and stopping them from lowering further. To fix this, I carved small divots into the front of the towers. These allowed the ramps to move much more freely, so they could rest on the battlements of whatever walls they were going up against. We don't want the ramps to be freely flopping open whenever we try to move them across the board though. To secure them in place, I made a beam going across the top of the towers, which I then glued a small magnet into. Now the magnet glued onto the ramp means they'll only open when wanted. To make sure that the magnets lined up, I attached the second magnet to the first once the first was in place, carefully dabbed glue on it, and then closed the ramp. This ensured that wherever the second magnet glued itself to on the ramp would be the right place to hold the ramp closed. The final detail for the ramps is to add some chains. These won't actually be functional, but they'll look nice when the ramps are deployed, and add interest by increasing the number of different materials and textures that can be seen on the finished pieces. These were just made using jeweler's chain, which was pulled taut and glued to the ramp, header and upper platform. The excess was cut off with some clippers. Unfortunately I lost the original footage for making the wheels and ladders, but I've re-recorded it so I can show you the process. I started with some 25mm bases. I glued coffee stirrers to them using superglue, mostly using the offcuts from making all of the planks earlier, and clipped them to be roughly circular. Because the bases taper slightly at the sides, make sure you leave a little extra length on the planks glued to the smaller surface. Sandpaper was used to smooth out the results and make them more circular. I used cardstock to make the metal tyres of the wheels. Pi times 25mm gives us a circumference of 78mm, which I increased to 85 just to make sure we had a little excess in case of any planks sticking out. I cut 8 strips of cardstock to this length and glued them around the edges of the wheels. Green stuff can be used to fill in any gaps at the end. To make the hubs and axles, small squares were cut from balsa wood and glued to the centres of the wheels. Short pieces of kebab stick were used to give the impression of axles, and a small disc of balsa was then added to the other side of the wheels to attach them to the tower. For these, I used some cocktail sticks for the rungs and some more stirrer sticks for the side rails. The cocktail sticks, minus their sharp points, were cut to equal lengths and then glued along the first side rail. I actually glued the rail to the cutting mat here to make sure it stayed in place, and then used the markings on the mat to make sure the rungs were spaced apart equally. Once they were dry, I added dabs of glue to each of the rungs and pressed the other rail on top. I then realised I'd made the mistake of using some wonky coffee stirrers and the rungs didn't all align properly to both sides. To try and fix this, I propped the ladders up and placed a weight on top of them while they dried. The wheels and ladders were then attached to each of the towers, along with an additional crossbeam towards the bottom to provide some extra strength. Next, I wanted to add some banners to the front of my siege towers, to tie them in a little better with the rest of my faction. We're going to be making these out of tissue and PVA glue. It'll be the same technique that I used to make the banner on this orc here. Take some regular tissue and cut out the shapes of your banners. I'm imagining these to be mostly made from ruined cloth that the orcs have looted, things like tent covers or enemy flags. For that reason, I want them to look a little misshapen, but you could just as easily use this method to make more pristine banners. Once I've got all of the shapes I wanted cut out, I glued them to some coffee stirrers and balanced them above a spare container. Then I used a pipette to gently soak them in water. Next, mix some PVA glue with a bit of water, and then use the pipette to soak your banners with it. By soaking them with just water first, we can be sure that the glue will be drawn all the way into the tissue, and we won't be left with any weaker or differently textured areas. If some of the tissue falls off while you're applying the glue, don't panic, just carefully pick it up with some tweezers and fold it over the drying line again. While the banners are drying, we can start on painting the towers. By using the materials that we have, we can actually skip most of the usual steps involved in painting a miniature. Apart from the metal tyres, which are painted with a dark metallic first, we can go straight to an all-over black wash. In this case I'm using an oil wash, but acrylic should work just as well. Be sure to test how strong your wash is on a spare coffee stirrer first, as you can always do a second coat if you want a stronger effect, but once it's soaked into the wood you'll have a heck of a time trying to get it out again. Here you can really see the grain of the wood standing out, as well as the natural variation in hue of the coffee stirrers. If I wanted to enhance this variation further, I could give a selective additional layer of wash to certain planks, but I'm quite happy with how it looks for now. It's the next day and everything is thoroughly dry. I started painting the banners with black all over, and off-white was used to freehand some symbols on the banners. Most of them are fairly simple orcish glyphs and the like, but I wanted at least one to be a little more artistic and represent the army's lore, so I painted the mounds that the orcs have been living on, beneath a dragon calling them to serve. This is my first attempt at doing some detail painting on camera, and holding it where the camera can see it properly definitely makes it more challenging, but I'm still pretty happy with how it looks. Once the banners were painted, I tried positioning them, without glue at first, onto the towers. Initially I was going to have lots of scrap banners covering the front of each, but I found I really liked the look of one larger banner flanked by two smaller ones, so I ended up going with that instead. The banners were glued in place with dabs of super glue. The last thing we need to do is to add some dirt around the bases of the towers. I assumed that caking them in wet mud would be unrealistic, as it would be too difficult to move the towers into position unless the ground was at least mostly dry, but a small amount of mud looks too good to leave it off entirely. With that finished, we can do a quick spray with a protective matte varnish and call our towers done. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to post them below. Until next time though, I've been Mark, I hope you have a wonderful day.